Somewhere in the forgotten hills of central Virginia, 4 men came to drain an ancient well. What rose from the black water wasn't mud or stone. It was a room. A room no map had ever marked. A room that had once held desperate human beings who prayed in the dark, and a family that would pay for it with their souls. The land still exists. You can walk it if you know the old game trails that snake between the ridges. But the farmstead itself has been erased from every county ledger since the summer of 1871. No deed. No tax record. No mention in the courthouse at all. It is as if God himself reached down and blotted the name from the book of the living. Old-timers in those hollows still speak of it only when the whiskey loosens their tongues and the fire is low. They lean in, eyes on the flames, and say the same thing every time: the trouble didn't start when the well went dry. The trouble started the moment the last bucket of water was hauled up and the man looked down into what should have been nothing but rock and darkness, and saw a floor that had been laid by human hands. A room 30 feet below the red Virginia clay. Built long before the Civil War. Built for a purpose so dangerous that 3 generations of one family spent the rest of their lives trying to pretend it had never existed. This is the story of the Whitaker farm. This is the story of the well that was never just a well. And this is the story of what divine justice looks like when it finally rises from the earth to collect what it is owed. Before we descend any further into the dark, if you're new here, welcome to the Liturgy of Fear. Hit subscribe and ring that bell. These are not ghost stories. These are true accounts of what happens when ordinary people choose between fear and conscience, and the land itself keeps the receipt. Drop a comment right now and tell me the state or city you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. Because the sins we bury in the ground have a way of calling out to the living, no matter where you are. The Whitaker family had been rooted in that narrow hollow west of Lynchburg since the late 1680s. Welsh miners by blood, hard people forged in the Black Valleys back home where the coal seams ran like veins beneath the skin of the world. They knew how to listen to stone. They knew how to read the hollow places before they ever broke the surface. When the first Whitaker Owen ap Rees sank his well in 1692, he wasn't only chasing water. He was chasing the memory of every mine he had ever worked. He sounded the ground with an iron rod the way his father had taught him. He found the soft note, the place where the limestone sang back empty. And when he broke through, the shaft did not end at a clay floor. It opened. It widened. It became something deliberate. He shored the walls with rough-hewn timbers. He laid a stone floor. He cut the ceiling higher so a man could stand upright. Then he sealed the knowledge inside the family Bible written in the old tongue, a single folded letter that would not be translated until the 1890s. The translation is clinical, almost embarrassed: a cold room beneath the water source. Dry. Safe from frost and spoilage. Accessible only by rope through the well shaft. For the preservation of life when the world above turns against us. For the next 150 years, that is exactly what it was. A root cellar. A meat cache. A quiet insurance policy against hard winters. The family grew. They built proper barns. They stopped lowering themselves 30 feet every time they needed a side of pork. The room slipped into legend, something the grandfathers spoke of but the children never saw. Until the 1850s. Elias Whitaker was the head of the household then. 54 years old, thick through the shoulders. Quiet in the way of men who carry more than they speak. He had 2 sons, Thomas and Harlan, both grown and calloused from the same red earth. He had a wife, Eliza, born of Pendleton from over in Amherst County, a woman whose family had always believed that scripture was not suggestion but instruction. And he had a daughter, Abigail, 17 in the summer of 1858, whose leather-bound journal would become the only honest witness to what happened next. They owned 3 enslaved people, a man named Marcus, a woman named Etta, and Etta's 12-year-old son Jonah. The law said they were property. Elias had inherited them the same way he had inherited the stone house, the rocky acres, and the well. He had not asked for any of it. But neither had he refused it. That quiet acceptance would become the crack through which everything later poured out. The hollow itself was a fortress of geography. Steep ridges on both sides, almost cliffs. A single dirt track that turned to red glue in the rain and ice in the winter. The nearest neighbor, old man Farley, and his grist mill 2 miles south, was close enough to hear a gunshot, far enough never to see a lantern at midnight. The Whitakers lived inside their own small kingdom. And kingdoms, as scripture reminds us, are judged by what they hide in the dark. The well sat dead center in the yard between the house and the barn. Dry laid fieldstone all the way down. In summer the air that rose from it was cool and sweet, like breath from a cave. In winter the stone lip stayed bare while frost silvered everything else. Abigail wrote about it often in her journal, not with fear at first, but with the casual affection you give something that has simply always been. She wrote of drawing water before dawn, the rope rough against her palms, the bucket clinking against the stone on its long descent. She wrote of Thomas once dropping the bucket and having to fish it out with a loop of wire while cursing the dark. And she wrote, more than once, of the sound. On very still summer nights, when the wind died and the crickets paused, something would rise from the well. Not wind. Not water. A low, irregular rhythm. Like breathing. Like a chest rising and falling far below. Abigail called it the well sigh. She said it made her uneasy in a way she could not name. She was 17. Unease was becoming her constant companion that year. Because the summer of 1858 was the summer the world above began to press down on the world below. 20 miles away, in Campbell County, a farmer named Josiah Hale was arrested. The Lynchburg newspaper printed the story on June 14. Hale had been running a loose, dangerous line moving enslaved men, women, and children north through the Blue Ridge Hollows toward the Free States. He had not begun as an abolitionist saint. He had begun as a man entangled, financially, morally, with a Quaker merchant in Lynchburg. One quiet bargain became many. Over 15 years, hundreds had passed through the mountains because of him. When Hale was taken, the tremor reached every farm that had ever helped. The authorities were patient. They knew the network was wide. They were willing to wait for someone to break. Elias Whitaker read the paper with the same flat expression he wore when checking a fence line. He folded it once, twice, and dropped it into the cook fire. 3 nights later, long after midnight, Abigail heard the soft knock at the back door. She lay in her bed above the kitchen, heart hammering, counting voices. Her father's low rumble. 2 others. Then the barn door creaking open, and, much later, closing again. She did not go downstairs. She wrote the next morning in her journal with the precision of someone who already understood that some knowledge is dangerous to possess. I do not yet know what I heard, she wrote, but I know it cannot be spoken aloud. Not even to Mama. What Abigail would piece together over the next years was this: her father had been part of Josiah Hale's route for at least 4 years. And the route used a feature of the Whitaker land that no county surveyor had ever bothered to measure carefully: the well. Because 30 feet down, just below the water table, the shaft did not end. It opened. It widened into a chamber that had been there since the first Welsh settler. A room no one above ground was ever meant to see. The original builders had not been looking for water alone. They had been looking for sanctuary. They had cut the limestone higher, laid a rough floor, shored the walls with timbers that by 1858 were black with age and beginning to weep sap like old wounds. They had created, in the belly of the earth, a place where a person could breathe without being seen. By the time the 4 hired men came in 1871 to drain and seal the well for good, that room had sheltered more than 70 souls. Men lowered on a rope and a board seat in the dead of night. Women clutching infants. Children who had never seen the stars without fear. They stayed 1 to 4 days. They ate the food and drank the water kept there in secret. They wrapped themselves in the heavy wool blankets Eliza Whitaker had quietly collected for years, not the thin, threadbare ones handed to the enslaved, but good, thick blankets that still smelled of lanolin and home. Eliza, it turned out, was not merely aware of her husband's work. She was its quiet architect. She had grown up in a household where the Bible was read at both ends of the day, and she had taken one verse and made it law inside her own heart: I was a stranger, and you took me in. She never preached. She simply acted. When the first frightened man was lowered into the dark in 1854, Eliza was the one who packed the basket of cornbread and salt pork. She was the one who stitched extra lining into the blankets so they would not scratch. She was the one who sat at the kitchen table long after the household slept, writing nothing down, but praying the same prayer over and over: Lord, if this is sin, judge me. If this is mercy, protect them. The room itself became more than a hiding place. It became a confessional. Abigail would later transcribe fragments from the journal she kept hidden even from her own father. She described how some of those who passed through left marks on the timber shoring, tiny crosses scratched with a fingernail, names written in charcoal that would be washed away by the next rain of seepage, prayers whispered so low they sounded like the breathing she had once heard from the well. One man, an older field hand named Isaiah, had stayed 3 days in the summer of 1857. He told Eliza, through the well shaft before they lowered him back out, that he had been born on a plantation where the overseer used scripture to justify the whip. Isaiah had memorized the book of Exodus in secret. When he left the Whitaker room, he pressed something small into Eliza's hand. It was a smooth river stone he had carried for 20 years. For the next one, he said, tell them Moses is still walking. Eliza kept that stone on a shelf above the wash basin until the day she died. The well had become a throat through which hope was swallowed and later coughed up, miles farther north, into the free air. And every time a new soul descended, Elias Whitaker felt the weight of 2 inheritances pressing on his shoulders: the inheritance of bondage he had never chosen to end, and the inheritance of mercy he could no longer refuse. He never spoke of it. Not to his sons. Not even to his wife after the work was done. But Abigail watched him. She saw the way he paused at the well each evening, lantern in hand, staring down as though waiting for judgment to answer back. She saw the new lines carved around his eyes. She heard him wake sometimes in the small hours, walking the yard, boots soft on the packed earth, stopping at the well mouth like a man visiting a grave. Because he knew what the rest of them were only beginning to suspect, that you cannot lower human beings into the earth and expect the earth to forget. That every prayer spoken in that room, every tear that fell on that stone floor, every heartbeat counted in the dark was being tallied somewhere. And the ledger of heaven, unlike the courthouse ledgers, is never erased. The summer of 1858 ended with the first frost. The network went quiet for a season. But the room waited. The well waited. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. And 13 years later, in 1871, when the last owners finally decided the well had run dry and hired 4 strong men to pump it out and seal it forever, the earth gave up its secret. What those men found at the bottom would send 2 of them fleeing the county by Wednesday, one of them refusing ever to speak of it again, and the 5th man, who finally went down alone, climbing out white as bone, climbing into his wagon, and driving away without collecting a single dollar of the pay he had been promised. Because the room was still there. The timbers still stood. The blankets, rotted now, still lay folded in the corner. And on the far wall, scratched deep into the limestone where no water could wash it away, was a single line in careful, desperate letters. We were here. Tell them we were here. The well had kept its promise. It had preserved life when the world above turned cruel. And now it was ready to tell the story no one wanted to hear. The room beneath the Whitaker well was never merely a hole in the ground. It was engineered. Deliberately. Lovingly. Over years. Someone had taken a raw fissure in the limestone 30 feet underground and turned it into a sanctuary capable of keeping human beings alive in total darkness. Timber shoring cut and fitted by hand. A plank floor laid so water would not pool. A narrow ventilation shaft that snaked upward through the rock and breathed fresh air from a hidden cleft on the north hillside, concealed behind thick mountain laurel that bloomed blood-red every spring. A small ledge carved into the wall held a lamp, always trimmed, always with enough oil for 4 days. Blankets, thick, woolen, carefully mended, were folded with almost reverent precision. And on a tin cup, placed exactly in the center of that ledge, rested a single folded sheet of paper. That paper contained a list of names. Not dates of birth. Not dates of death. Just names. Some written in a strong, careful hand with ink that had faded to the color of dried blood at the top. Others added later in a different, shakier script, the ink darker, more urgent, as though written by someone whose hands trembled with the knowledge of what they were recording. The list had grown over decades. It was still growing when the well was finally drained in 1871. The fifth workman could read slowly, haltingly, but he could read enough. He stood in that underground chamber, lantern light flickering across the stone, and understood in his bones that he was not looking at a root cellar or a smuggler's cache. He was looking at a ledger of souls. A private book of life and death written by people who believed that if the law of man could not free them, perhaps the mercy of God still could. He climbed out of the well white-faced, refused every question, collected nothing, and drove his wagon out of the county before sunset. He would later tell his wife only one sentence, spoken so quietly she had to lean close to hear it: "Some things are supposed to stay buried." That room was keeping a promise. The contractor, Silas Poor, was a hard-headed practical man from Lynchburg. He knew when a laborer had seen something that broke him. He did not press. He simply ordered the well sealed from the top with heavy stones and mortar, then built a low wooden cover over the mouth so no child or animal could ever fall in. For years he spoke of it to no one. Until a quiet legal inquiry reached him in 1876. The letter he eventually wrote to attorney Edmund Casey survives only in fragments among Casey's estate papers. In it, Poor describes the room with the flat precision of a man trying not to feel what he is describing: the careful ventilation, the preserved blankets, the lamp still ready for use, the tin cup, and the paper inside it. He does not copy the names. He only says the list was written in at least two hands, begun long ago and added to over many years, as though each new soul left their mark before moving on toward whatever freedom waited in the dark. What happened to that paper between 1871 and 1879 remains one of the deepest mysteries of the Whitaker story. It vanished. Not destroyed by water or time, but taken. Removed by hands that knew exactly where to find it. Whether those hands belonged to someone seeking justice, someone seeking revenge, or someone simply trying to protect the living from the weight of the dead, no one has ever been able to prove. What we do know is this: in 1877 the Whitaker farm changed hands for a price far below its already diminished value. The buyer was a holding company whose principal investor was Cornelius Dabney, a man who had sat on the county court in the years before the war, a man who had thrown himself into the hunt for Josiah Hale's underground network with something far beyond professional duty. To Dabney, the secret routes were not merely illegal. They were an abomination against the natural order of things. An order he had spent his life defending and that the war had shattered. In the years after Appomattox, while others tried to rebuild their fortunes, Dabney tried to rebuild the old hierarchies in any form he could find. He paid informants. He read sealed documents. He followed whispers that others had long forgotten. And somehow, nearly 20 years after Josiah Hale's arrest, his search led him to the sealed well in Whitaker Hollow. He purchased the land. He let the house sit empty and rotting for 2 years. Then, in the winter of 1879, the stone house that had stood since the 1680s burned to its foundations. Stone does not burn easily. But everything inside it did: the floors, the ceilings, the furniture, the letters, the family Bible, every scrap of paper that might have explained what had happened in that hollow between 1854 and 1861. The well itself survived. The room beneath it survived. But the visible record of the Whitaker family's long secret was reduced to ash. Some in the county whispered that the fire was no accident. Others said it was God's judgment finally catching up with the land. Abigail Whitaker, by then married and living 40 miles away in Rockbridge County, wrote a short letter to her daughter about the fire. Her words are careful, almost formal, until the final lines: "The old place is gone now. Perhaps the trouble can finally be allowed to rest." She never explained what the trouble was. She never needed to. Her daughter kept the letter only because it was from her mother. Abigail herself had known about the room since she was 17. She had known far more than the surviving pages of her journal revealed. There were 14 months missing from that journal, pages cut out so cleanly with scissors that the binding still looked untouched. The removed section covered the period from autumn 1858 through the end of 1859, the dangerous months after Josiah Hale's arrest, when the entire network went silent and no new souls moved through the hollow, at least none that were supposed to move. What happened in those 14 months inside the Whitaker house and 30 feet below it in the secret room remains locked in the silence Abigail chose for herself. She lived until 1903. She outlived her husband and 2 of her children. She watched the world transform in ways the girl who once drew water from that well could never have imagined. But she never returned to the farm. She never spoke of it directly in any surviving letter. She carried whatever she had seen, whatever she had heard through her bedroom window on those midnight nights, whatever prayers or screams or quiet thanks had risen from the dark below, locked inside her own heart until the day she died. Because some knowledge is too heavy to share. Some mercy is too costly to explain. And some sins, once committed in the name of justice, demand to be remembered only by the land itself. Yet the land does remember. Even after the house burned and the well was sealed and the list of names disappeared, the hollow kept its secrets. Old-timers still say that on certain still nights, when the wind dies and the laurel blooms red on the north ridge, you can stand near where the old well once stood and hear something rising from the earth. Not wind. Not water. A low, irregular rhythm. Like breathing. Like many hearts that once beat together in the dark, still keeping time. And sometimes, they say, if you listen long enough, you can almost make out words, faint, desperate, carved not into stone but into the memory of the air itself. We were here. Tell them we were here. The room had done its work. It had preserved life when the law demanded death. It had sheltered the stranger when the world above refused mercy. And now, decades later, the well was beginning to collect on the debt. Because divine justice does not always arrive with trumpets and fire from heaven. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives as a list of names written in 2 hands. Sometimes it arrives as a fire that consumes stone. And sometimes it arrives as the slow, patient rising of what was buried. The Whitaker family had made their choice in the name of conscience. Cornelius Dabney had made his in the name of order. And the land, red Virginia clay, ancient limestone, and all, had become the final witness. A witness that would not stay silent forever. The trail of the Whitaker well could have died quietly in the ashes of the 1879 fire and the carefully scrubbed courthouse records. It nearly did. But secrets this heavy rarely stay buried when the land itself seems determined to speak. In 1921, a woman named Prudence Farley, granddaughter of Crockett Farley, the grist mill owner who lived 2 miles south of Whitaker Hollow, cleaned out her parents' attic after their deaths. Among the ordinary papers of a 19th-century miller, grain ledgers, price lists, old deeds, she found something that did not belong, a sealed envelope in her grandfather's cramped, careful handwriting. On the outside, in plain ink, were the instructions, "Do not open until I am gone out of this world 20 years." Crockett Farley had died in 1883. 38 years had passed. Prudence, a practical 53-year-old schoolteacher from Amherst County who was not given to fancy or fear, broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written on both sides in the methodical hand of a man who had spent his life keeping honest accounts. Dated July 1868, 9 years after the events it described, the letter was part confession, part final ledger. It detailed exactly what Crockett Farley had known about the Whitaker farm and the room 30 feet below the well. He had known far more than any neighbor should. He had known because, sometime in the early 1850s, Nathaniel Whitaker had begun testing him with careful, indirect conversations, never a blunt proposal, always a slow feeling out, the way a careful man speaks when the wrong word could destroy lives. Farley had weighed the risks. The risk of helping seemed manageable. The risk of knowing and doing nothing felt heavier, like a different kind of sin. In the end, he decided the blankets and the lamp oil were small things to provide. But what he had not anticipated was how the knowledge would live inside him. It did not end when he handed over the box of supplies and walked home. The why of it stayed. The thought of men, women, and children lowered into darkness on a rope and a board seat haunted the quiet hours at his mill. He was not a religious man in any loud way. His wife had been Presbyterian. He sat beside her in the pew and let his mind wander during sermons. Yet after the first year of quiet involvement, certain verses began to surface unbidden while he watched the water turn the millwheel, the stranger in a strange land, the valley of the shadow of death, the command to love your neighbor as yourself. These thoughts did not help with the practical work of milling grain, but they changed the sound of the water. It carried weight now. A moral gravity he could feel but never quite name. His mill was too public to serve as a station itself. Instead, he became a supplier and a watcher. He bought blankets in small lots from a dry goods store in Lynchburg so no one would notice the pattern. He provided lamp oil. And most importantly, he watched the road. After Josiah Hale's arrest in 1858, when investigators swept the hill country, Farley sent quiet warnings whenever strangers rode too close to Whitaker Hollow. The letter was written in the detached past tense of a man making his final accounting. But then the handwriting shifted. The letters grew slightly larger, less steady, as though the pen itself resisted what came next. In September 1859, 14 months after Hale's arrest, when the network was cautiously stirring back to life, Farley was walking his horse home late after repairing a broken wheel shaft. The moon was down. The road was rough. As he approached the stretch overlooking the Whitaker farm, he saw lights where no lights should have been moving at that hour. 2 lanterns in the yard, moving in the familiar pattern he recognized from legitimate visits, one near the barn, one near the well. But there was a third light. It appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that could only mean one thing: someone was being lowered down the well shaft, lantern in hand, then brought back up. He stopped on the road and watched in silence. Over roughly an hour and a half, he counted 11 complete trips. Down and up. Each taking 8 or 9 minutes. He knew the rope and board system well. He had once helped lower a sack of seed years earlier when the storage story was still plausible. 1 person at a time. Supplies could go faster, but a living soul required care. 11 trips. Not all were people descending. Some were surely supplies or the rigging of the rope. But Farley calculated that at least 5, perhaps as many as 8, were human beings being lowered 30 feet into the black earth on a single September night in 1859. He did not approach. He did not call out. He walked home, went to bed, and the next morning went to his mill as if nothing had changed. But he wrote the number down 11 with the precision of a man who understood that someday the full account might need to be settled. That was not the most disturbing part of the letter. 3 weeks later, Farley visited the Whitaker farm to return a borrowed tool and talk harvest. He found Nathaniel Whitaker alone in the yard near the well, not cleaning it, but examining it. Running his hands slowly over the upper stones. Leaning far over the opening. Listening. Farley greeted him. Nathaniel straightened, said hello, and claimed nothing was wrong. When pressed, he admitted he thought he had heard something. Like a voice, he said quietly, but probably just the wind. Farley handed over the tool, stayed 20 minutes talking of ordinary things, and left. But as he walked back down the road toward his mill, the image would not leave him: 11 trips down the shaft on that September night, and the possibility that not every soul who had gone down had come back up. He never asked Nathaniel Whitaker about it. He simply wrote the question into his letter in 1868, sealed it, and left it for the future to judge. When Prudence Farley read those words in 1921, she sat motionless at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she carefully replaced the letter, returned the envelope to the box, and put the box back in the attic. She told no one immediately. But the arithmetic had lodged in her mind like a splinter, always there, never quite ignorable. Prudence was not a woman prone to imagination or hysteria. She had taught school for decades. She dealt in facts. Yet the numbers refused to settle: 11 descents. The possibility that some of those lowered into the room had not been moved onward. The image of Nathaniel Whitaker listening at the well mouth for a voice that should not have been there. 6 years later, in 1927, she finally acted. She wrote a careful letter to Professor Elbert Hull, a historian at a small college who had begun documenting what was still cautiously called the Underground Railroad, the network of courage, faith, and hidden places that had carried thousands northward before the war. Prudence described her grandfather's letter in general terms without revealing its full contents. She asked whether he knew of any routes through the central Virginia hill country and whether the Whitaker farm had ever appeared in his research. Professor Hull replied within a week. His 3-page letter began with a sentence that made Prudence set down her coffee and sit very still. I know the Whitaker place, he wrote, not from living memory, but from two independent sources I have never been able to reconcile until your letter arrived. The first source was a fragmentary account published in a Pennsylvania Quaker newsletter in 1864. The writer, who gave no name, described traveling through the mountain country of Virginia some years before the war. He spoke with deliberate vagueness, knowing even then that details could endanger others. But he mentioned a farm in a narrow hollow, an old well, and a descent into the earth that he compared, trying for lightness, to going down into the mines of the old country. Below, he wrote, he found not a cave, but a room. And in that room waited 6 other people. 7 souls together in the stone chamber beneath the well. The timeline placed this sometime in 1857 or early 1858, before Josiah Hale's arrest. The second source came from the papers of Caleb Drummond, the Lynchburg Quaker merchant who had first drawn Josiah Hale into the network. Drummond died in 1869. His documents eventually reached a Quaker meeting in Philadelphia. Among them were cryptic notes written in English mixed with personal shorthand. Hall had spent years decoding them. The notes referred repeatedly to a station Drummond called simply Stone Bottom. Supplies delivered. Route confirmed. Stone Bottom holding 7. Stone Bottom holding 7. Route north clear as of the 14th. Then, in the same sequence, a single stark entry a week later. Stone Bottom. No word. Route north closed. 7 people in the room at once. A number that matched the Quaker traveler's account. And then, silence. Prudence Farley did the math again. The splinter became a wound. The room beneath the Whitaker well had been built to preserve life. To offer mercy when the law offered chains. But on that September night in 1859, when Crockett Farley counted 11 trips, something had gone wrong in the dark. The network was fragile. Investigations still lingered. Routes could close without warning. And when a hidden station suddenly held too many souls with nowhere to go, the consequences could be measured not in blankets or lamp oil, but in human lives suspended between hope and the grave. Nathaniel Whitaker had stood at the well mouth listening for a voice. Abigail Whitaker had cut 14 months from her journal, the exact period when the room may have become less a passage and more a prison. And the land itself seemed to remember every soul that had ever breathed its damp, limestone air. Because mercy extracted in secret always carries a price. Sometimes the price is guilt that never leaves a man's mill wheel. Sometimes the price is pages cut from a young woman's journal. Sometimes the price is a fire that consumes 2 centuries of records but leaves the well untouched. And sometimes the price is measured in the difference between 11 descents and the number who finally saw daylight again. The room had been built with care. It had been used with desperate hope. But in the long silence after 1858, when the world above pressed too close, even the best-intentioned sanctuary could become something darker. A place where prayers were whispered. A place where breathing was heard rising on still nights. A place where some names on the hidden list may have been the last record of lives that ended not in freedom, but 30 feet underground, waiting for a route that never reopened. The well had kept its secret for decades. But secrets, like sin, have a way of demanding their day of reckoning. And the reckoning was only beginning. The room beneath the Whitaker well was never meant to hold 7 souls for 15 months. It was built for days. Maybe a week at most. Enough preserved food, water, lamp oil, and heavy wool blankets to keep desperate people alive while they waited for the next leg of the journey north. The ventilation shaft breathed just enough fresh air through the hidden cleft in the laurel. The plank floor stayed dry. The timbers shored the limestone walls like ribs around a fragile heart. It was an act of sustained, deliberate mercy engineered by a Welsh-descended farming family who believed that hiding strangers in the earth was a higher law than the one written in Richmond courtrooms. But in June 1858, when Josiah Hale was arrested and the entire network went to ground, everything changed. Word traveled down the chain in frantic whispers: investigators were coming. Contacts were scattering. Routes north were closed. No one could risk movement. For the 7 people already lowered into the stone bottom, the room 30 feet below the Whitaker yard, there was nowhere to go. They could not climb back out in daylight. They could not return south without certain recapture. They could not continue north. They were sealed beneath the red Virginia clay with supplies calculated for temporary refuge, not prolonged entombment. No record exists of those 7 ever reaching the Free States that summer. No group arrest was documented in the hill country either. The silence that followed was its own terrible verdict. Professor Elbert Hull, the historian who pieced together fragments from Quaker newsletters and Caleb Drummond's cryptic notes, could find no trace. The Pennsylvania account spoke of 7 souls together in the room in 1857 or early 1858. Drummond's shorthand mentioned Stone Bottom holding 7, then, after a short gap, only 2 bleak lines. Trouble at Trent. Advise caution. All stations. Stone Bottom. No word. Route north closed. The route never reopened in time for everyone. In September 1859, 15 months after the shutdown, Crockett Farley, returning late from his mill, saw lanterns moving in the Whitaker yard. He counted 11 trips. Down and up. But when Prudence Farley connected the dates in 1927, the truth reversed with chilling clarity. Those were not new people being lowered in. Those were the ones who had been trapped below being brought out. One by one. In the dead of night. Over roughly 90 minutes. What condition were they in after 15 months underground in a space designed for days? How many had survived? And for those who had not, what did Nathaniel Whitaker do with the bodies in a hollow where every stranger on the road could mean discovery, arrest, and the destruction of his entire family? Crockett Farley never asked. He simply wrote the question into his sealed 1868 letter and left it for the future. But one small detail in that letter refused to stay quiet. On an ordinary visit sometime after 1860, Farley noticed that the ground north of the well, between the shaft and the steeplage, had been replanted with grass. It grew thicker there, darker, more lush than anywhere else in the yard. Nathaniel had muttered something about grading work and moving earth. Farley had nodded and thought little of it at the time. But in 1868, when the weight of memory pressed too heavily, he included the observation anyway. Just in case. Prudence Farley, sitting alone at her kitchen table in 1927 with her grandfather's letter and Professor Hull's reply before her, followed the chain of reasoning to its bitter end. She was a schoolteacher. She understood evidence. She understood what thick, dark grass often hides in old farmland. She wrote back to Hull. She told him everything, the 11 trips upward, the listening at the well mouth, the voice Nathaniel thought he heard, the patch of unnaturally rich grass. She asked the question she could no longer avoid. Hull's reply was shorter. Careful. Measured. He acknowledged that the Whitaker farm had been a vital station. That the sudden closure in 1858 had created an extreme difficulty for everyone involved, especially those trapped below. He noted that historical records of such operations were often incomplete by deliberate design. He expressed a desire to visit the property and examine the ground north of the well shaft himself. He never made the trip. Professor Elbert Hull died of pneumonia in February 1928, 4 months after writing that letter. Prudence lived until 1941. Before her death, she passed the letters and the sealed envelope to a niece with instructions to keep them safe. The niece, never fully grasping their weight, stored them with other family papers. Decades later, the box reached a small historical society archive in central Virginia. It was catalogued without fanfare and filed away. The Whitaker land itself remains. It changed hands several more times after Cornelius Dabney's quiet purchase in 1877. The stone house burned to its foundations in 1879. The barn collapsed. The well was sealed with heavy stone and mortar exactly as Silas Poor had ordered in 1871. Today the area north of the old well shaft is overgrown with cedar and sumac, the way abandoned Virginia hollows tend to reclaim themselves. But locals who still walk the old game trails say the grass there even now grows a little thicker, a little darker, than it should. The room below has never been officially examined. The limestone fissure that the first Welsh settlers sounded in 1692 still runs cool and north to south beneath the earth. The timbers have likely rotted. The plank floor may have collapsed.
The ventilation shaft still breathes, faint and hidden behind mountain laurel that blooms red each spring.
And on the limestone wall, according to the fragments Abigail Whitaker chose not to cut from her journal, there are
marks. Not words. Just lines.
The kind people scratch when they are counting days they are no longer sure they will see the end of.
Abigail never said how many lines there were.
She never said whether anyone finished counting them. The list of names that once rested in the tin cup at the bottom of the room is gone. Removed sometime between 1871 and 1879 by hands that understood its power, whether to prove mercy, to prove guilt, or to prove both. It may have been Cornelius Dabney who took it.
It may have been someone seeking to protect the living.
It may still exist, folded inside an old Bible or sealed in another forgotten envelope.
We do not know.
What we do know is that real people, flesh and blood, bearing real names, descended into that darkness trusting a farmer's family and a stone room to keep them safe until freedom called.
Not all of them answered that call. Nathaniel Whitaker died in 1873 at age 68.
The family Bible, kept by Abigail, records the cause simply as winter fever. He lived 2 years after the well was drained and sealed. He never spoke publicly of what had happened in the summer and fall of 1858. He simply carried on, walking past the well each evening, perhaps pausing sometimes to listen, perhaps praying in the way of a man who had made choices with no good options, only the terrible arithmetic of survival in a broken world. We cannot say with certainty what he decided when the route north closed and 7 souls became his responsibility alone. We can only see the outcomes: the sealed well, the missing journal pages, the fire that consumed the house but left the well untouched, the patch of ground where the grass still grows unnaturally thick.
Because mercy, once extended, does not always end cleanly.
Sometimes it becomes a burden heavier than chains. Sometimes the sanctuary you build to save others becomes the place where you must confront the limits of your own humanity. Sometimes divine justice does not arrive with angels or thunder, but with the slow, patient witness of the earth itself, red clay, ancient limestone, and grass that remembers what was buried. The Whitaker story is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a story of ordinary people caught between the law of the land and the law written on the heart.
Between inherited sin and chosen mercy.
Between the desire to do good and the terrible cost when the world refuses to cooperate. It reminds us that official history is often written by those who survived with power intact. The erasures were not the work of one man or one conspiracy, but the accumulated silence of dozens of small, fearful choices made in a time when truth could destroy families as surely as lies could. And yet the land refuses to forget. On certain still nights, when the wind dies and the laurel blooms, some say you can still hear it, a low, irregular rhythm rising from the sealed well.
Like breathing. Like many hearts that once counted days together in the dark.
And sometimes, if you listen long enough, the faintest scratching, like fingernails on limestone, marking lines that no one ever finished counting.
The room is still there.
The marks are still there.
The question is still there. What really happened in the summer of 1858 when the route closed and 7 souls were left alone in the stone bottom? Did every name on that lost list eventually breathe free air again? Or does the thicker, darker grass north of the well tell a quieter, heavier truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Tell me what you believe the silence truly hides.
If this story kept you awake, if it made you feel the weight of choices made in darkness, share it with someone who understands that history is never just the past, it is the ground we still walk on. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear.
Ring the bell.
Because there are more hidden rooms beneath the surface of our shared story than any official record will ever admit, and we intend to keep finding them.
Until next time, listen carefully to the ground beneath your feet. Some wells were never meant to stay silent forever.